You just realized your business needed to hire someone yesterday. How can you find amazing candidates fast? Easy. Just use Indeed. Stop struggling to get your job post seen on other job sites. With Indeed sponsored jobs, your post jumps to the top of the page for your relevant candidates, so you can reach the people you want faster. According to Indeed data, sponsored jobs posted directly on Indeed have 45% more applications than non-sponsored jobs. Don't wait any longer. Speed up your hiring right now with Indeed. And listeners of this show will get a $75 sponsored job credit to get your jobs more visibility at Indeed.com/ARTS. Just go to Indeed.com/ARTS right now and support our show by saying you heard about Indeed on this podcast. Terms and conditions apply. Hiring? Indeed is all you need. You just realized your business needed to hire someone yesterday. How can you find amazing candidates fast? Easy. Just use Indeed. Stop struggling to get your job post seen on other job sites. With Indeed sponsored jobs, your post jumps to the top of the page for your relevant candidates, so you can reach the people you want faster. According to Indeed data, sponsored jobs posted directly on Indeed have 45% more applications than non-sponsored jobs. Don't wait any longer. Speed up your hiring right now with Indeed. And listeners of this show will get a $75 sponsored job credit to get your jobs more visibility at Indeed.com/kidsandfamily. Just go to Indeed.com/kidsandfamily right now and support our show by saying you heard about Indeed on this podcast. Terms and conditions apply. Hiring? Indeed is all you need.
Ooh, a spicy question. I
because
love
the writing is sort of everything, right? Like you kind of can fix plot holes, but if the writing is
so some readers love that, and some readers are like, "But I wanted more of this." So it's kind of a gamble.
Hello and welcome back to the Right and Wrong podcast. On today's episode, I am joined by a historical fiction author, an alumni of the Curtis Brown Write Your Novel course, and winner of the Caledonia Novel Award 2022. It's Alex Hay. Hello.
Hello. Thank you so much for having me.
No, great to have you on. Let's jump right in, starting with your new book, the second novel, The Queen of Fives, which came out just a few weeks ago. Tell us a little bit about it.
With great pleasure. So The Queen of Fives is a historical con, and it's set in the summer of 1898, telling the story of Queen LeBlanc, who is London's premier conwoman, also known as the legendary Queen of Fives, famed for her ability to lift a man's fortune with 5 moves in 5 days. But times are tight, and Quinn is about to embark on her most audacious scheme yet, infiltrating the wealthiest family in Berkeley Square. But as she begins to enter their mysterious orbit, she starts to realise that she may not be the only person playing a game of grand deception. So think big houses, bad families, and all the deliciously dark, glittery, Victorian, high Gothic gloss that I adore, with a spirit of a hustle-esque con behind it.
So it's very much following in the wake of your first novel, The Housekeepers, more kind of historical heisty shenanigans.
Shenanigans all the way. Yeah, that is the word for it, 100%.
Is like writing heists, this sort of historical Ocean's 11 kind of vibe, is that very much your wheelhouse? Is that what you love in literature?
Well, that's a good question. I think there's two things going on here. So a heist plot or a con plot are a real gift to a writer from a structure and storytelling perspective. And I really love the quite clear shape, particularly of a heist, actually, with very clear movements. Gather your team, you set your plan, you fling obstacles at the gang along the way, and you have, I think, permission to try and pull off a conclusion full of surprises and zest and shenanigans to your heart's content. And that's all really appealing to me. And those crime caper archetypes are quite satisfying to try and plot and put together. Bit head-scratchy to try and plot as well, but they lend you so much from a writing perspective. I think what I found with my first book, what was really enjoyable, was trying to glue that crime archetype onto an historical setting. And in my first book, that was about really playing with high Edwardian Park Lane glamour. And in my second, it's about writing something of my own love letter to a slightly earlier period, perhaps sort of 7 years backwards, and playing with more of the tropes of late 19th century sensation fiction. So really for me, it's about trying to glue all those things together, setting and plot, and then to try and create a story world that feels really fun to play in. And I've loved writing both these books, and in a way they sort of feel like twins, sharing some of those tones and themes, as you say.
Yeah. And yeah, I mean, I think just based on the kind of vibe of the books, you can tell that it was fun to write them because they're like fun books inherently.
I agree with that. And I think it's, interestingly for me, I have lots of books sitting in drawers that I sent out to agents or never really got over the line. And they were all quite dour and gloomy. And I think the fun element was what I was really looking for when I first started writing The Housekeeper, something that would just feel a bit more joyous to me, and would give me the chance to have jokes and surprises, and an eccentric cast, which are all things I love to read as well. So finding that sort of uplifting side of the writing process really switched something on for me. So yeah, it's been a joy to write book 2 as well, in the same vein.
Okay. And you mentioned, I don't know if this is a heist plot and a con plot, are they separate things, or is it sort of two ways of describing a similar style?
I think they're quite separate things.
Okay.
So heists, I think, are quite firmly structured. I think the archetype is quite well established. I think cons, by the nature of dealing in a protagonist who's shape-shifting and double dealing and being deceitful around every corner, I think you have a bit more room to work out what your own long con is going to look like. There are some, fantastic traditions around the con. So the sort of sense of there being sequential moves that a con artist will move through to best ensnare their mark. And I absolutely played with some of those tropes when writing The Queen of Fives, trying to take some of those classic con moves where you knot your targets and separate them from all who love them and could protect them from the fraud that's about to be pounced upon them. But I tried to sort of wrap a bit of a high Victorian Gothic gloss around all of that. But at the same time, I think a con plot, certainly in my book, I discovered it's a much more shifty thing, because you're dealing probably more in twists and surprises, and also essentially quite tricky question for a writer, which is, at the end of the day, your con artist, it is fraud that they're carrying out. It's not the most a moral pathway for a character. And so finding a way for you as the author to care about what they're doing and understand what their code of conduct looks like and why they're on this journey actually took more head scratching than I expected. And I think that's where a con story is tricky, because you're really dealing in that sort of anti-hero, anti-heroine space that you have to think quite carefully about who are they targeting, why, and how's that payoff going to feel satisfying and not sort of thin to the reader. So it's a tricky plot structure, but one I love to play with.
Okay. Is it important in that kind of situation, when you're sort of trying to find a way to get the reader on side with the protagonist, that you make the target of the con unlikable in some way?
Yeah, I think that's really key. And for me, this is a story about a con woman at the top of her game, operating in late Victorian London, who runs her swindler's emporium, the Chateau, in the streets of Spitalfields. And effectively, what I loved doing was designing the history of that household and working out what's the rule book that guides each of Quinn's cons, each of her games. What are those moves? And what's the moral code that household has set up over the century that it's been in operation to justify its actions to itself? And one of the key things it's done is to say it's only allowed to mark noblemen or wealthy men who are deemed corrupt by the Chateau standards. And that's quite satisfying because, of course, then you're operating in quite a morally grey space. Who decides who's bad? And do the ends justify the means when the household is going after them? And I think that's one of the questions that the characters start to wrestle with in this book. And definitely one of the ones that I really enjoyed sort of plotting and pondering when putting the book together.
Oh, okay, right. A sort of more nuanced Robin Hood sort of thing.
Exactly. Yeah. A nuanced Robin Hood is a perfect way to put it, actually. And there's lots of Robin Hood Easter eggs in this. Lots of people charging around in Lincoln Green and thinking about, what does the neighbourhood around me need? And when we score these cash sums, who are they going to? And what's going to be better as a result of the criminality that we're pushing forwards? And some of the answers that your characters will come up with are quite glib, and they're not necessarily probing themselves or their own moral code very deeply. And that was one of the joys of this book was once that household starts to think about, why are we doing this? Is it worth it? And indeed, the people we're marking, do they have their own game afoot? And are we perhaps being swindled as much as the ones we're swindling? Then you're suddenly sort of turning that whole moral setup on its head. And that was really delicious stuff to play with for me.
Yeah. I can tell that you're very invested and interested in the sort of the history of it and the reality of that history. And like you said, this novel and then your previous novel, they're sort of 7 years apart, both at the turn of the 20th century. What is it about that period that you like really fascinates you?
Well, I think there's something about writing the late 19th century and early 20th century, which gives you quite a lot to play with. And one part of that is you've got in the rearview mirror all the high Victorian atmosphere and setting that you could ask for. And for someone who's writing historical fiction and historical crime, that's all really, really lovely stuff to be playing with. And for me, the sensation fiction of late 19th century, say, foggy streets, gaslight flickering, themes of degeneracy and doubleness and duality and repressed desire, all of that Victorian stuff felt really perfect to me for a com. Mm-hmm. But then at the same time, you have, with the turn of the century, these glimpses of modernity and this sense, actually, that the 20th century is roaring into view. And you sort of see it in photography and accounts of the period, the sense that the motor car is just around the corner. We know, of course, that the Great War is looming, even though your characters don't. And I think what that gives you is this sense of quite an enterprising, forward-looking, anxious time that actually has lots of resonance for a modern-day author or reader. And I like that interplay between that sort of old world and the sense of something new and scrappy and uncertain coming up around the corner. So lots, I think, tonally to play with if you're writing the kind of books I'm writing.
Yeah, sort of on the precipice of so long ago that it's, it feels old-timey, but also not so long ago that you're like, well, they did have some technologies that we do have today.
Yeah, exactly that. And also things like dialogue and, the tone of the book. I'm really influenced, actually, by late 19th century, early 20th century fiction. Books that you can just feel instantly in the way the characters talk to one another, that there's just something that feels very contemporary and very present and very alive. And actually, this is not it's not stiff dialogue. It's not mannered. There are certain themes in that fiction of the time that might be shimmering a little further beneath the surface than we could get away with today. But there's a sense of realness about the fiction of that period that I try and sort of absorb, or I suppose have absorbed a little bit by osmosis over the years through reading. And so that's all quite fun to play with, because it does surprise a reader sometimes. I know in The Housekeepers, those characters, if they need to get from point A to point B, sometimes the most efficient way to do it is to get the tube. And, it will surprise people. So you've got to be quite selective, I think, about the details that you're picking that don't jolt yourself or the reader out of the story because they feel anachronistic in the wrong way. You've got to try and get the tone right and the voices of the characters right. But equally, I quite enjoy playing with those little details that might surprise a reader or prompt a reader to think, oh, was that really, was that there in 1898 or 1905? And if it is, it's quite satisfying to make sure it's in there, so that your London feels authentic, but also relevant.
Yeah. It's also interesting because when I think of most heist, especially like heist movies, most of them are set contemporary or in the modern time. So I would imagine it's quite fun to do this kind of story without phones or video cameras and things like that.
I mean, it's totally helpful, first of all, because it can keep people on, the opposite side of the city with no idea of what's going on, and allows you to have plenty of confusion and skullduggery along the way.
Yeah.
But yeah, it is a joy to write that slightly older world, but with as much zest as you can muster, because it does allow you to play with some of the eccentricity of the past. In The Housekeepers, I love doing things like trying to research, okay, I've got an entire Park Lane mansion load of guests stuffed inside this house, which we're trying to rob. How am I going to get them all outside of the house in a couple of minutes? How can I find an invention from the period that would simulate a fire? And you start to go looking for these pretty zany contraptions that Victorians would come up with to simulate cigarette smoke or create huge blooming, billowing masses of fog inside their drawing rooms. And you realise, there's some just lovely theatrical stuff in the historical record that I can lift and use and borrow and adulterate slightly for my own plot. And you just wouldn't have that if it was set in the 90s. You'd have other brilliant, wonderful stuff. But that's part of the joy of trying to play.
You just realized your business needed to hire someone yesterday. How can you find amazing candidates fast? Easy. Just use Indeed. Stop struggling to get your job post seen on other job sites. With Indeed sponsored jobs, your post jumps to the top of the page for your relevant candidates, so you can reach the people you want faster. According to Indeed data, sponsored jobs posted directly on Indeed have 45% more applications than non-sponsored jobs. Don't wait any longer. Speed up your hiring right now with Indeed. And listeners of this show will get a $75 sponsored job credit to get your jobs more visibility at Indeed.com/ARTS. Just go to Indeed.com/ARTS right now and support our show by saying you heard about Indeed on this podcast. Terms and conditions apply. Hiring? Indeed is all you need.
With all these details.
Okay. So obviously when we're talking about historical fiction, probably of all the genres, it's the one that often has the most significant research element to it. Does your research happen, do you do it all before you start writing, or is it kind of just a throughout, you're always researching something new?
That's a really good question. I mean, I'm always picking up research questions as I go, and I'm guessing that's probably common for most people who write in this period, or in historical fiction generally. For me, books typically begin with setting and then a plot structure that I want to play with. And the first step is always trying to glue those two things together. And that was definitely true for The Queen of Fives. So I knew I wanted to, having loved writing a heist, I wanted to try another classic caper archetype. So I wanted to try a con, but I wanted to do a setting that felt a little bit earlier than my first book. And I wanted to play with, as I was saying before, some of those foggy, gaslit London streets of sensation fiction lore. So the first job for me was trying to do quite practical research on who were some of the real-life 19th century fraudsters in operation at that time. What were their methods? How did they practically lift fortunes from people? How did they, or did they, get away with it? And that was all sort of information that was new to me. But then there's other stuff which I suppose comes much more organically over the years, which is all the reading, both fiction and non-fiction, that you do, that gives you lots of details that have lodged in the back of your mind, and you're drawing on sort of almost unexpectedly as you write. And of course, then there's a job to do once you've got a draft in hand, to go back and check that you weren't completely off the mark and dating things completely erroneously or putting stuff in the wrong place at the wrong time. Because I think there's a code with historical fiction, which is either you are making a pact with the reader that every single thing they read is based as far as possible on fact, from a sort of practical perspective, down to the weather, for example. The characters in your story are moving through a world that's rendered as accurately as it could have been if you had been there at the time. And that the imaginative terrain of the book is then, being made up. But the framework of the world is really, really solid. And then there's another side of things, which is where you I think, trying to take the tone and spirit and voice of the world, but you're giving yourself liberty to change some of those textual details, like the weather or the date of certain events. And you're moving stuff around in the service of your plot, but you're hopefully trying to stay truthful to the kind of feel of what it would sound and feel like, so that a reader's not going to feel jolted out of things too much. And I'm definitely in that second camp. And I've had really interesting discussions actually with other historical fiction authors about which side of the divide they sit on. And I think what I've noticed is everybody really cares about making sure that the world feels truthful and accurate, and the story feels immersive to the reader. And, readers are really smart, and a lot of them will know this period incredibly well, and will even know, masses of details that you haven't come across. So you want to be really selective and thoughtful about what you're including or excluding, so that it's all just going to feel entertaining and enjoyable, and not anachronistic in the wrong way to a reader. But that's really subjective, and it's hard to work out what a reader's going to feel about it until you get the book out there.
Yeah, and it sounds like you are very focused on the details. And I think, did you mention earlier that you are a writer that plans everything out before you start writing it?
Well, I have gone on a bit of a journey on that score. So my first book, The Housekeepers, I planned to within an inch of its life. And the reason for that was that I really loved the idea, and I just did not want to let myself down. And so I planned in Excel, scene by scene, chapter by chapter, in excruciating detail. And actually I went back to that spreadsheet recently and I looked at it, and the cells, they're huge. There's thousands and thousands of words on that spreadsheet. So actually, I think what I did was, in hindsight, I don't think I did plan. I think I basically flew by the seat of my pants, but in Excel, which is the weirdest and most grim way to write a book in the world. Anyway, however I got there, managed to get my first draft down. Happy days. And when I came to start book 2, I thought, well, this is my process now. I plan everything out, really, really know where I'm going. And then, joy of joys, I can dive into the first draft and I'll sail through. And this time, that process totally fell apart for me. So the plan just felt really lifeless, crowded, confusing. The characters didn't work on the page. And I sort of tried, got to about 10,000 words, axed it, tried again, got to about 20,000 words, axed it, and then started having a panic and became a sort of full-blown discovery writer. Went back to page 1 and just started writing scene by scene, following the characters, keeping that sort of core set of ideas in mind. It's a con. It's in this particular Victorian era. I have my protagonist, but I'm going to let her mark her target and encounter complications along the way. And it was a really freeing process to try and write a book filled with surprises in that quite surprising fashion. And I think what it gave me was a lot of really organic stuff that actually lifted the book off for me and gave it the kind of life I was after. But it also meant the first draft of that book was an absolute bonfire. It was complete disaster. So the editing was completely exhausting because I had to wrangle all of that material into a shape that would feel coherent for the reader. So who knows what my process is now, David? I think I'm somewhere in between the two, but I'll just have to pray that I can work it out by the time I finish book 3.
That's so interesting, because most of the time my experience with people is on their debut novel, they discover it and then they become planners after they've been through publishing because of timeline constraints and things. Yeah.
And I hear that a lot as well. The sort of the need for efficiency is that you're going to have to sort of plan where you're going, and just being really honest about it. I think where I've got to is a place where my third book, I sort of put together a synopsis for the story that sort of spread over a few pages, that gave the kind of key beats, key reveals, and gave me a sense of what the overarching architecture of the book would be. And then I'm writing the first draft with that in mind, and sort of perhaps noting to myself a couple of chapters ahead each time, right, this is going to happen, this is going to happen, this is going to happen.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't have that full outline. And the reason for it for me is I actually found, from an efficiency perspective, I just lost so much time planning because I felt I had to plan, and that planning would save me time, that there were weeks and weeks going by where I was trying to put this story together that just wasn't going to work on the page. And the quickest and most efficient thing to do was get in there, see how everybody was feeling, and then try and be led by character in that way. So I think at the end of the day, sort of every book is its own beast. You've got to find whatever process is going to just get you to the end. That terrifying first draft.
Yeah. Well, I imagine it's almost reflective of the change of genre with your these first two novels, because your first novel was a heist, which I think in essence is always going to be meticulously planned, because the characters will have meticulously planned the heist, whereas a con is much more you have a vague idea of what's going to happen, but you know, the con person is always going to have to adapt on the fly to whatever new situation comes to them. So it's almost indicative of the difference in the genres of your two novels, the way you wrote them. Why
didn't I just talk to you, Jamie, in September 2020, what was it, 2022, when I was literally having a breakdown? I was like, what do I do? I've got no skill for this. Yeah, you're right. They're different plot structures, and I totally found that as well. That cons, and I was sort of alluding to this earlier, it's up to you, isn't it, how you want to shape it. There's much more room there to be a bit devious and let your characters be a bit devious too, but therein lies both the joy and the terror of putting that story together. But, you know, I'm really, really happy that I can officially say I have been a pantser, which is a very satisfying thing to have done. So, you know, who knows if I'll stay in that mold or not, but we shall see.
I think that's a good way to do it, is that you've kind of done both, you've tried both, and now you can find what works best for you somewhere in the middle of that kind of journey.
Yeah, and I think also, I don't know if other writers are like this, but I am quite faddy about processes. And someone once said this to me at work. They went, Alex, you're very faddy. You'll kind of go for whatever framework you think is going to best suit you at that time. And then as soon as you're bored with it, you will move on to something else. And I thought, that is true, actually. But unfortunately, with writing books, you don't have your annual appraisal in the same way. You just have to try and tell yourself whether you're doing effective work and using effective methods to get there. But I think what you just said is spot on. It's about just you trying to find your way of doing things. And I used to spend so much time just reading blogs and listening to podcasts and trying to, you know, find the perfect save the cat meets X meets Y process that would work and would give me a book that I felt was super saleable, because that was my goal. I really, really wanted to get published. I really wanted it. And I thought, if I find the right process, I can make it happen. And actually, it is much more organic than that. You just keep going back to your own instinct as a reader, and the types of stories that you love to read will end up being the types of stories you love to tell. And each book is different, and you just have to do whatever you can to find how to make that book work. And that's a sort of slightly scarier, but also much more freeing way to look at things, that, you know, book 3 will have its own process, and book 4 and book 5 and book 6 will all be completely different beasts. So, you know, strap in, off you go, and pray for the best.
Yeah. But like all crafts, the more you practice it and kind of the more different approaches you try, you'll assimilate the best parts of those for you, so that then next time you do it, you know, even if you're doing a different fad this week, you'll have the memory of those other things that you've done, and those will seep into, like, you'll just get better with time, like the more you practice.
Yes. This is very reaffirming, this conversation. Thank you very much. I'm going to take that.
Yeah, that's great. That's what the podcast is all about. We are at the halfway mark, which is where I ship you off and ask you, Alex, if you were stranded on a desert island with a single book, which book do you hope that it would be?
So I knew you were going to ask this. And this is an insight into my thinking process that I just found it so difficult, overcomplicated it massively, because I was like, am I going to come off the desert island? How long will I be there? You know, what are the stakes in this situation? So my rambling answer to you would be, let's assume that I'm not going to be on the desert island forever, and I just need something that's going to, you know, entertain me until the the rescue. This is a half glass full way of looking at things. Rescue is definitely going to happen. So I just need a good read in the meantime. So I think I'd probably want to go for something, maybe a reread, something I haven't read for a long time. So I'll have forgotten the twists and turns of the plot, but I can count on to feel heartwarming and gripping. And it also has to be nice and long. So I was thinking possibly something like John Irving's A Prayer for Owen Meany. I remember reading that in a huge gulp, I don't know, maybe 20 years ago, and just absolutely loving it. So that was the first thing that sprang to mind. I thought that would be a good, juicy read. But if I'm going to have to be on the island forever, and I need to really look deep into my soul and understand the nature of the human condition, then I suppose I will have to take Middlemarch. So it really depends on you, Jamie. If rescue is afoot, then it's Prayer for Owen Meany. If I'm there forever, then George Eliot's going to have to carry me through.
Okay. Well, both those answers are acceptable given various conditions. I like to ask the question and then see how people approach it. Like I give no rules or strict, things in like, this is how long we're going to be there. And everyone tackles it in different ways. So I like that. I like that
it's all the thinking process. Two different ways. It's like an exam paper, isn't it? It's like, show your workings, you may get a mark.
Exactly. Yeah. I want to see your working. Really, that's what's in it for me. So. But that's great. Yeah, a diverse choice. You've got fun and light and intense.
Exactly. Me.
Yeah. Next up, I'd love to get into a bit more about the publishing side of things and chat about Alex's agent as well as experiences working with Headline Review, and that will all be in the extended episode available on Patreon.
I leave in hope every time it's going to have an even better position than it had when I came in.
That's the hope. Yeah. Awesome. Well, we are at the end of the episode, and there's nothing else to say. But thank you so much for coming on. It's been awesome chatting with you and hearing all about your writing and publishing adventures.
Oh, thank you. They've been adventures indeed. Lovely to be here, and I really appreciate you having me. Thanks so much, Jamie.
For everyone listening, The Queen of Fives is out right now in all the usual places. And if you want to keep up with what Alex is doing, you can follow him on Twitter and Instagram at Alex Hay Books, or head over to his website, alexhaybooks.com. To support the podcast, to support the podcast, like, follow, and subscribe. Join the Patreon for ad-free extended episodes, and check out my other podcast, The Chosen Ones and Other Tropes. Thanks again to Alex, and thanks to everyone listening. We will catch you on the next episode.
You just realized your business needed to hire someone yesterday. How can you find amazing candidates fast? Easy. Just use Indeed. Stop struggling to get your job post seen on other job sites. With Indeed sponsored jobs, your post jumps to the top of the page for your relevant candidates, so you can reach the people you want faster. According to Indeed data, sponsored jobs posted directly on Indeed have 45% more applications than non-sponsored jobs. Don't wait any longer. Speed up your hiring right now with Indeed. And listeners of this show will get a $75 sponsored job credit to get your jobs more visibility at Indeed.com/kidsandfamily. Just go to Indeed.com/kidsandfamily right now and support our show by saying you heard about Indeed on this podcast. Terms and conditions apply. Hiring? Indeed is all you need. You just realized your business needed to hire someone yesterday. How can you find amazing candidates fast? Easy. Just use Indeed. Stop struggling to get your job post seen on other job sites. With Indeed sponsored jobs, your post jumps to the top of the page for your relevant candidates, so you can reach the people you want faster. According to Indeed data, sponsored jobs posted directly on Indeed have 45% more applications than non-sponsored jobs. Don't wait any longer. Speed up your hiring right now with Indeed. And listeners of this show will get a $75 sponsored job credit to get your jobs more visibility at Indeed.com/ARTS. Just go to Indeed.com/ARTS right now and support our show by saying you heard about Indeed on this podcast. Terms and conditions apply. Hiring? Indeed is all you need.